If you're creating a homebrew D&D setting, you probably want to spend some time developing history and lore, and that's the subject of today's video. Now I'm going to cover this in two parts. Firstly, I'm going to talk about what essential elements you want to have in place if you don't have that much time and you want to just quickly get your lore and history elements in place before the campaign begins. This is good if you maybe don't have a lot of time, or if you just don't feel a particular urge to dwell on this part of the world building. Then in the second half of the video, I'll talk to the people who maybe do have the time or do have the urge to go into their lore in a bit more depth before the campaign begins. We'll talk about stuff which, while not being essential, will add a lot of value to your prep process and which might generate ideas for adventures and plot elements in the campaign. As always, if you have time, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Now let's talk about timelines, history, and lore. Okay, so you're developing your history, but you don't have a lot of time to do it. Let's start at the beginning. The gods. How many gods do you need to develop? Do you need to create an entirely new pantheon? Absolutely not. You've got two options here. You can either just grab the entire pantheon from the Forgotten Realms, the classic gods in kind of canon D&D, and take them wholesale into your campaign, or you can take those gods and just give them different names and make some very small edits to make them feel a little bit more distinct, but essentially use those gods as your baseline template. Now, you might want to have specific gods in there that are a little bit different from the classic D&D gods because of the kind of plot that you're planning to run in your campaign, and that's fine. You can make edits to that one particular god or add a new god in there, but you don't have to create the entire new pantheon. I think that if you're in a rush, this is probably a good idea, because a lot of the time the players are never going to have that direct an interaction with the gods as they go about their game. The same goes very much for the creation myth of your world. You don't necessarily need to know how this world formed. You can just steal that wholesale from whatever it says in the official D&D literature you want to draw from, or you could even just say that the origins of the world are lost in the mists of history and myth and legend. Perhaps there was a large cataclysm that happened, history hasn't really been recorded, and now we just have vague hints of how this world might have begun. Either way, you don't need to dwell on it too much. I would suggest that you pick one god from your pantheon and develop a kind of religious organization based on that god, something akin to the Catholic Church in our world, but based on one of the gods in your pantheon. So look at where the players are starting, look at the geographic zone in your world where their story begins, and decide which god has kind of come out on top in that region. Maybe all the gods are being worshipped there, but one might have risen to the top and now has a kind of structured organization of worshippers, clerics, priests, and bishops who are now perhaps kind of gaining political power and wealth in that region. It just makes the world feel quite interesting if the players are traveling through it, and they can tell that although all the religions are being worshipped here, one god seems to be kind of leading the pack, and their representatives are now perhaps in the court of the monarch, whispering in the ears of the powerful rulers of the realm. It adds a bit of depth to the setting. Now let's say you have your pantheon of gods and you have a vague idea of a creation myth, and these could have been just lifted out of another setting and tweaked slightly to make them feel a little bit more distinct for your players in this particular setting that you're developing. Now you want to create a very rough timeline of recent world events, perhaps going back over the last 1,000 years or so, and divide it up into ages or eras. And this is basically going to free you from worrying about the precise years in which things happened. You break up a millennia into perhaps 5 or 6 distinct ages, and you give each one an evocative sounding name, like the Age of Shadows, the Age of Dragons, the Golden Era, something like that. The players will get an idea from that. Oh, that was when dragons were in charge, that was when society was at kind of a golden peak, that was when darkness fell and the evil magician took over. Doesn't really matter. The point is that your players are not going to have to worry about whether this is the year 1331 CDE or something. Instead, they're just going to say, oh yeah, I think that event happened in the later years of the Age of Dragons, or at the height of the Golden Era. You don't have to get too precise about the exact dates of events in your history. And this also means you're essentially creating folders in which you can put different historical events. You can look at each historical age that you've created, and you can put 1 or 2 big key events in that. Well, what happened in the Age of Dragons? Dragons woke up, there was a big war, dragons took over, then there was a revolution, dragons went away. you know, that could be all you have for the Age of Dragons, but that will be enough for when the players start going through your world and they see ruins from the past. They say, how did this city get destroyed? You say, well, that was from the final revolution during the Age of Dragons. And they'll think, wow, this DM really knows their stuff. They have this whole world worked out. So yeah, create a simple timeline with a couple of key events in each of your ages that are sort of folders spaced along that timeline. Now, if you're short on time and you don't want to develop too much history, the next step is to add a cataclysm in there. A cataclysm is some kind of major event that essentially prevented ancient history from filtering into the modern day. It's kind of the cutoff on recorded history, and it could be something like a massive series of natural disasters. It could be something like an ice age, massive earthquakes, a huge war that broke out between the two factions of gods, or perhaps the sundering when the material plane and the Feywild were torn apart. Perhaps before that they were fused together. Something like that, where basically history was written before then, but all those records have been lost because of the cataclysm. And the reason you're putting this in there is because A, it's a fun trope, it's a cool thing to have in there, but also it kind of excuses you from knowing a lot of ancient history. If the players look back too far, they say, well, who actually founded this city? You say, well, this city was actually, it's an ancient city, it was founded before the great cataclysm of Dragonfire. And the players go, oh, well, that checks out, that's why we don't really have accurate records of the early days of the city. So cataclysms, I mean, they can be a bit obvious. A lot of fantasy has them, and a lot of D&D settings have them, but they are really fun, and they're used often for the reason that they kind of excuse you from having too much ancient history pre-developed. Finally, because we're short on time, stop writing the history and start writing the story that you're going to play out in the modern day with your players. Now, the reason you want to do this next is because once you have a rough idea of what the adventure is that your players are going to be focusing on, at least initially, you'll know what history you have to develop. So if the players are going to immediately go on a big quest to find an artifact from the Dragon Wars, then okay, you need to know what happened in the Dragon Wars. But if they're not going to get involved in political intrigue or court politics, then okay, you don't need to know who was king 200 years ago. So although you want to have some of those kind of key building blocks in place, like the gods, the ages, the timeline, once you get a clear idea of what the modern day story is going to be, that's when you know where the specific history has to be developed. There's no point in spending time before the campaign developing history that is never going to come up in the campaign. So get the key stuff in place that you'll need for when the players go on their main quest, and then you can fill in the blanks later. If you have all of that in place, you've got enough history and lore to make the setting feel really genuine and lived in when the players step into it. You'll obviously keep adding to it and developing that history over time, but with things like the cataclysm and the slightly unreliable narrator elements you've built into your history, it means that you've got a lot of wiggle room when you want to expand and evolve the history much later on in the campaign. Now we're going to turn to the people who are watching this video who maybe have a bit more time to sit down and develop their history. They maybe get a kick out of it, like I do, out of developing lore, and they want to, you know, sink time into developing stuff that the players might never see. That's what we're going to talk about now. Let's go back to the start and talk about creation myths and gods. Obviously, you can start with the traditional D&D pantheon as kind of a template, but developing your own gods will give you such an insight into your world and how it developed. Understanding the rivalries between gods and the religions that formed around them is kind of the bedrock on which a lot of the later kind of politics and social structures of your world will develop. I don't spend too much time developing the gods themselves, but I do spend a lot of time working out what kind of organized religions spawned around those gods, because organized religions can have a far bigger impact on this kind of the shaping of history than monarchs or wars and nations. Politics almost pales in comparison to the impact that religion can have, especially in a world where the gods are very present and sending their signs into the world. So I would say don't do a huge pantheon necessarily. Pick a kind of a core pantheon of perhaps 6, 7, 8 deities and develop each one. They should cover a particular field of your world. One might cover things like war, heroism and battles. Another might cover the ocean and seafaring or adventuring. You can kind of develop a domain for each one, but then think about the sort of people who would follow them. Think about the structures that would develop as people began to worship these gods. Did the religions begin as perhaps a nomadic people? Why did they end up settling down? Were they persecuted, or were they perhaps raised to positions of power in the way that the emperor in Rome, Constantine, sort of raised Christianity after persecution and made it the dominant religion in Rome? You know, those are the kind of the beautiful points where religious history and political history start to merge and interweave. And as you develop that sort of stuff, you're going to start having a lot of ideas for the plots you want to run in the modern era. So, for example, if as you're writing the history of one of your religions and one of the gods, you think, oh, there could be a cool relic or an artifact that was created by one of the gods themselves. Well, where is that relic now? Is it being pursued by the people within this religion? Has it been corrupted and stolen by a rival god or a demon? Suddenly you've got plot elements that might really impact your players because you've spent time developing the timelines of these religious organizations. As a side note, a trope I really love is the missing god. The idea that there's a pantheon of perhaps 7 gods, but there are hints here and there in the world that there should be an 8th god there, and that at some point in the past, perhaps pre-cataclysm, that god was defeated or imprisoned or removed, and now no one talks about that god, and we kind of pretend in the modern day that they weren't there. You get this sense that there's a kind of unreliable element to the history that the players are being fed. And that kind of brings us to our next point, which is the twin timeline approach. What you want to do is create 2 timelines. The first timeline is going to be much like the one we talked about earlier, with the different ages and eras. Even if you have loads of time to develop your history, I would suggest not asking your players to remember calendar dates in a fantasy world. Instead, just things like early golden era, late golden era, high golden era. That's the kind of stuff that players can wrap their heads around easily. So get that timeline in place, get those epochs in place along it as kind of dividing folders into which you can put different historical events, but then create a second timeline. So your first timeline is essentially what the world thinks happened. It's what is being taught in schools. It's what the players are remembering when they do successful history checks, at the start of the game at least. But the second timeline is what really happened. It's the sort of canon history of your world, and it's the history that really no one in the world has access to. You have access to it as DM, and individuals within the world might have access to little parts of it, but probably no one has the full big picture of how the entire history of the world played out. And your players will begin only really having access to the first timeline, the kind of history as it's perceived timeline. But over time, part of their quest can lead them on a journey where they learn more about the true events, where over time they realize that perhaps people believe that a certain king was a wise, just ruler, but in reality he was this monstrous tyrant, and perhaps he kind of rewrote history so people would remember him in a different way. That stuff can be so rewarding for the players because it means that just by exploring and kind of digging into the lore, they get this sense that they're finding out information that no one else has access to. And it incentivizes players to learn about the lore of your world if they feel that there's a mystery there to be uncovered. Now, do you need a cataclysm in your world? Well, obviously not. Cataclysms are a trope, and you don't need to use any trope if you don't want to. And admittedly, cataclysms are a very overused trope. They're in, a lot of, in Dragonlance, in Critical Role, in a lot of major fantasy and a lot of D&D stuff, you'll find that trope. But I think there's ways to do it which can be quite subtle, and which will give you almost the same effect as a cataclysm without having some big world-ending event in the past. For example, something as simple as the collapse of one big civilization. I mean, look at our world, again, going back to the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire collapsed, it was or declined, it was so integrated with so much of Europe that its collapse essentially meant the collapse of functional record keeping, of the arts, of sort of widespread communication across the continent. And that dark age that came in after the fall of Rome is kind of a cataclysm in the real world, in the sense that we're using it here. So look at things like, for example, the collapse of a single large empire. Or another thing that I love is the the organization that suppresses history. So for example, maybe there's a very zealous religious organization or an authoritarian structure like a powerful empire that didn't want the old history to come through, and so they actively burned records, destroyed libraries, or maybe took that history and stored it in hidden vaults and archives that your players might have access to later on. And now history has been actively suppressed, and so when players look back on a certain era, they can't find those early records. And I think that's a good way to essentially have the effect of a cataclysm without, maybe if your player is a little bit more tuned into fantasy tropes, without making them feel that you're relying on something that they've heard before. Finally, I would say put a bit of focus on factions and organizations in your world, and develop at least the sort of recent history of these organizations. When you're looking at guilds, religious orders, orders of knights and clerics and paladins, these orders and these groups will have a history because someone founded them at some point. They've probably had an impact on world events over time, and knowing that, once again, is going to very quickly start giving you ideas for plot lines you can run in the present. For example, if you have, say, a guild of mages, well, who founded them? Perhaps there was a powerful wizard who founded that guild of mages, but eventually became drunk on power and became a lich, turned to darkness. And that's perhaps a shameful secret that the guild of mages has put behind them. But where is that lich now? Well, maybe that lich in the modern day is imprisoned in a prison deep below the guild's headquarters, or in a parallel dimension. The guild now has like special mages whose job it is to guard the lich who founded the organization, and perhaps there's a young mage in the modern day who's trying to release that lich. Whatever it is, suddenly by developing the history of the organization, you now know what impact that might have on the players in the present, and the storylines kind of write themselves. I often think that we think of world building and plot development sometimes as two separate things, but they don't have to be. They can be completely intertwined. And the best world building, the best history and lore development is the stuff that's going to have a direct impact on the players. Because at the end of the day, the players want to make history rather than learn history. They want to feel that the history that's happening around them is something they are very actively a part of. And they're just not going to be that good at recalling all the details and information of a deep hidden lore unless it feels very pertinent to them, and unless they feel that they're having an impact on that history as it develops into the present. Players want to make history, not learn history. That's a good line. I like that. I'm going to print that out and stick it on my DM screen so I don't forget it. But also, I mean, if you want to make history, if you want to write the detailed step-by-step history of your world, absolutely do it. Just bear in mind that a lot of it might never reach the players. And I do think it's incumbent on us as DMs not to force that stuff on our players, because a lot of people, it's a Friday night, they want to sit down and kill some monsters with their friends. They don't necessarily have the mental capacity and the energy to pick up on all the historical details that you're laying out. So by all means, go deep on your lore, but just know in advance that a lot of that might not come to the surface for most of the campaign or at all. That's everything I wanted to cover in this video. This is the second part of a 4-part series we're doing on the channel about developing your next homebrew setting. In the last video, we covered things like the scale and the geography of your world, nations, coastlines, that kind of thing. In the next video, we're going to talk about rulership and governance. Who is in power in your world, and how does that impact on the players? I also want to give a quick shout out to my patrons. I'm filming this on a camera bought by my Patreon money, using a mic bought with Patreon money, and I'm going to edit this on a computer bought with Patreon money. So the patrons are basically funding this entire channel, and I have so much love and appreciation for them. Also, if you're watching this video, thank you so much. Like and subscribe, all that stuff, but I appreciate you sticking around and supporting the channel, and I will see you in the next video.